Milwaukee looks peaceful today, but years ago, one crime family controlled the streets with fear and explosions. Even top mob bosses were scared of them, and it all started with one man who refused to play by the rules. This is the story of a crime family that terrified even the mob bosses of Las Vegas, a family that turned America's dairy land into a kingdom of fear, and one man who ruled it all with an iron fist and a taste for explosives. The year was 1903 when Vito Gardalabine stepped off a ship from Sicily, carrying with him more than just the hope of a new life. Born in Santa Flavia, a small coastal town where the Mediterranean meets ancient traditions, Gardalabine brought something far more dangerous than dreams to America's shores. He brought the old ways, the code, the structure of the Sicilian mafia. At age 58, he wasn't a young man seeking fortune. He was already made, already powerful in the old country, and Milwaukee's Third Ward would become his new kingdom. The Third Ward in those early years was a different world, a slice of Sicily transplanted onto the shores of Lake Michigan. Italian and Sicilian immigrants flooded into this neighborhood, escaping poverty and seeking opportunity in America's industrial heartland. They worked the docks, the factories, the warehouses. They spoke their native tongues, celebrated their saints, and brought their customs across the Atlantic. But they also brought their problems, their feuds, and their methods of settling scores. The Third Ward became Little Italy, a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone, where old country loyalties mattered more than American law, and where a certain kind of man could build an empire if he knew how to command respect and fear in equal measure. Vito Gardalabine understood this better than anyone. By 1911, he had become a naturalized American citizen, but his allegiance remained to a different code. According to the memoirs of Nicola Gentile, a Sicilian mobster who traveled across America in those early years, Gardalabine was recognized as the king of Milwaukee's Little Italy by 1915. This wasn't just a nickname. In the Third Ward, Gardalabine's word was law. He controlled who got hired and who got fired. He decided who received loans from the local Italian banks and who was turned away. He settled disputes, arranged marriages, and determined which businesses could operate without trouble. And those who needed these services paid tribute, a percentage, a fee for protection and access. The structure Gardalabine built was brilliant in its simplicity. He didn't need a massive organization or hundreds of soldiers. He had family, and in Sicilian culture, family meant everything. His sons and sons-in-law became his enforcers, his advisors, his connection to every corner of the Third Ward. When Giovanni Battista Gardalabine arrived from Sicily in 1900, he moved in with his brother-in-law on Chicago Street, right in the heart of Milwaukee's Italian district. His brother Angelo followed in 1902. Then came Isidore Aiello, who married Vito's daughter Antonina. Nunzio Maniaci joined the fold in December 1902, marrying into a politically connected family with Giovanni Battista serving as his best man. 3 of Maniaci's 10 sons would later join the Milwaukee mob, cementing the family's grip on the underworld for generations. The Gardalabines didn't just control crime. They controlled commerce, politics, and community life. They ran a small bank that provided loans to newly arrived immigrants, charging interest that sometimes came with conditions that had nothing to do with money. They owned legitimate businesses, ran social clubs, and maintained connections to the Republican Party through strategic marriages and partnerships. In the Third Ward, you didn't go to the police when you had a problem. You went to Vito Gardalabine. He was the judge, the banker, the protector, and the punisher all rolled into one. Prohibition hadn't even begun, but Gardalabine's organization was already thriving on traditional mafia rackets: extortion, counterfeiting, gambling, and labor racketeering. By 1913, Milwaukee's district attorney publicly acknowledged what everyone in the Third Ward already knew. He stated that secret murder and blackmail organizations operated in the neighborhood, and the police could do little to stop them. The Italians in the Third Ward refused to talk to authorities, knowing that cooperation with police meant retaliation, and retaliation in Gardalabine's world meant disappearing into Lake Michigan or ending up in a ditch with a bullet in the head. Then came February 6, 1921, and Vito Gardalabine died of natural causes. He was 76 years old, having ruled Milwaukee's underworld for nearly 2 decades. His death could have meant chaos, a power vacuum that would tear the organization apart, but Gardalabine had planned well. His son Giovanni Battista, known as Peter in some records, smoothly assumed control of the family operations. The transition was seamless, a testament to the structure Vito had built. The organization he created wasn't dependent on one man's personality or force of will. It was a system, a dynasty, and it would survive. Peter Gardelebin's reign was shorter than his father's, lasting only until 1924 when he turned control over to a distant relative, Giuseppe D'Amato, known on the streets as Big Joe. The reasons for this transfer remain murky, lost to history and the code of silence that surrounded these men. Perhaps Peter lacked his father's appetite for violence. Perhaps he wanted to focus on legitimate business. Or perhaps the organization needed someone more ruthless, someone willing to do what was necessary as competition increased and territories became more contested. Whatever the reason, Big Joe D'Amato took the reins of the Milwaukee Mafia, though his tenure would be tragically brief. D'Amato, like the Gardelebins before him, had been born in Santa Flavia, Sicily. He arrived in America as an adult and settled directly into the Third Ward, where the Gardelebins and Ballesteros were already numerous and powerful. In late 1910, he married Stefana Pizzo, herself newly arrived from Sicily, connecting himself further into the web of relationships that defined Milwaukee's Sicilian underworld. But leadership in the Mafia has always been a dangerous position, even when death comes from natural causes rather than violence. On March 28, 1927, Giuseppe D'Amato died of pneumonia. He was only 41 years old. Once again, the Milwaukee family needed a new boss. Entered Joseph Vallone, another Sicilian immigrant who had come to America from Prizzi in 1907. Vallone would prove to be one of the most important bosses in Milwaukee Mafia history, not because of violence or expansion, but because of timing. He would lead the organization through Prohibition, the greatest money-making opportunity organized crime had ever seen, and through the consolidation period that followed, when the American Mafia organized itself into the structure that would define it for the next half-century. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, Milwaukee was perfectly positioned to become a bootlegging empire. The city had been built on brewing. Pabst, Miller, Schlitz, these weren't just beer companies, they were Milwaukee's identity, massive operations with the infrastructure to produce and distribute alcohol on an industrial scale. When the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal, those same breweries and their networks didn't disappear. They went underground, and men like Joseph Vallone controlled who could brew, who could sell, and who could transport the product. The Third Ward exploded during Prohibition. By 1915, before alcohol was even illegal, there were already 29 Italian saloons in the neighborhood, along with 45 groceries, a bank, and 2 spaghetti factories. When booze became contraband, those saloons became speakeasies, the groceries became fronts for bootlegging operations, and money flowed through the Third Ward like never before. Peter and Angelo Gardelebin, sons of Vito, ran the Monte Carlo Club at 171 Detroit Street, a notorious establishment where raisin wine flowed and gambling happened in back rooms while police conveniently looked the other way. Milwaukee's police couldn't compete with the mob's organization, but the federal government could. In 1929, a federal agent named John Cunningham launched such an aggressive campaign against Third Ward bootleggers that by New Year's Eve, the Milwaukee Sentinel ran headlines worrying whether there would be enough alcohol left in the city to ring in 1930. The paper warned readers about dry force to stem holiday cheer and noted that federal agents would be posing as out-of-town playboys looking for party tips, ready to arrest anyone transporting liquor on the streets. For a brief moment, it seemed like law enforcement might actually win, but they didn't. The Milwaukee Mafia was too entrenched, too organized, too connected to legitimate power structures through politics and business. In the early 1930s, a federal grand jury indicted Joseph Vallone, along with Third Ward political power Angelo Gardelebin and 43 other defendants, for operating a regional bootlegging syndicate. It was a massive case, an attempt to decapitate the entire organization, yet Vallone survived. The exact outcome of his case is lost to history, but what is known is that he remained in power, and by 1933, when Prohibition ended and alcohol became legal again, Vallone and his partner Migliaccio simply opened the Broadway Liquor Company, turning their illegal operation into a legitimate business overnight. This was the genius of the Milwaukee Mafia under Vallone's leadership. They understood something that many other criminal organizations didn't. The real money wasn't in being outlaws forever. The real money was in controlling industries, both legal and illegal, in diversifying, in building empires that could survive changes in law and policy. Gambling remained illegal, so they controlled the bookmaking operations. Labor unions were powerful, so they infiltrated the docks and the Teamsters. Vending machines needed placement, so they monopolized the vending business. Loan sharking preyed on desperate people, so they became the bank of last resort for those who couldn't go to legitimate lenders. During this period, something else happened that would shape the Milwaukee Mafia forever. The organization's relationship with the Chicago outfit crystallized. Chicago, under Al Capone and later Tony Accardo, was the undisputed power in the Midwest. New York had its five families, but in America's heartland, Chicago ruled. The Milwaukee family was never truly independent. From its earliest days, even under Vito Gardalabine, the organization possibly functioned as a branch of Chicago's operation. By the time Vallone led the family, this subordinate relationship was formalized. The Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia established in the early 1930s, decided that Milwaukee would answer to and remain under the Chicago outfit's power. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing for Milwaukee. Being under Chicago's protection meant access to national networks, arbitration when disputes arose, and backup when local law enforcement became too aggressive. It also meant sharing profits and following orders, but for a mid-sized family in a mid-sized city, the arrangement made sense. Vallone seemed to understand this. His administration in the 1930s and 1940s reportedly included Joe Gumina as underboss and Charles Zarcone as consigliere. The inclusion of Zarcone was significant because it showed that any divisions between different Sicilian factions in Milwaukee, those from Prizzi versus those from Santa Flavia, had been resolved. They were now one family, one organization, under one boss. Vallone ruled for over 2 decades, a remarkable tenure in a world where bosses often died young and violently. He retired from active leadership in 1949 and died of natural causes on March 18, 1952, at peace with his role in building one of the Midwest's most powerful criminal organizations. Before his retirement, Vallone had groomed Salvatore Ferrara, known as Sam, to succeed him. Ferrara was a relative and fellow native of Prizzi, a natural choice for succession in a world built on family and regional connections. But Sam Ferrara's time as boss would be brief and tumultuous, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overstepping authority in a world where power ultimately flows from Chicago. In 1952, Ferrara made a critical mistake. He attempted to acquire an ownership share of the Ogden Social Club, a gambling venue owned by a rising young mobster named Frank Balistrieri. When Balistrieri resisted, Ferrara used his authority as boss to expel Balistrieri from the family entirely, throwing him out of the organization, cutting him off from the rackets, essentially declaring him persona non grata in Milwaukee's underworld. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Balistrieri wasn't just any soldier. He was connected, ambitious, and more importantly, he had friends in Chicago. The membership of the Milwaukee family, seeing Ferrara's action as an abuse of power, voted to depose him, an almost unprecedented move that showed how much support Balistrieri had within the organization. Then they did something even more unusual. They requested intervention from the Chicago outfit to officially remove Ferrara from power. In November or December 1952, a panel of senior mobsters from Chicago arrived in Milwaukee to settle the matter. This wasn't a jury of peers. This was the Supreme Court of the Midwestern Underworld. Tony Accardo, one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history, sat in judgment. So did Rocco Fischetti and Sam Giancana, men whose names alone carried weight across the country. They heard the case, reviewed the evidence, and reached a verdict. Ferrara had abused his position. He was demoted, stripped of his title, and forced to step down. After only 4 years as boss, Sam Ferrara's reign was over. But who would replace him? The answer surprised some people and set the stage for one of the most important transitions in Milwaukee Mafia history. The Chicago panel didn't elevate Frank Balistrieri to the boss position, at least not yet. Instead, they installed John Alioto, known as Papa John, a man who had been deeply connected to the organization for decades but had kept an incredibly low profile. Alioto was born in Portisolo di Santa Flavia, Sicily, in 1888. He arrived in New York on March 20, 1904, just a year after Vito Gardalabine, on the ship Liguria. He settled in Milwaukee, became a naturalized citizen in 1926, and married Catherine Alioto at Our Lady of Pompeii Church, the beautiful little pink church that would become the spiritual center of the Third Ward's Italian community. Alioto had children, including a son named Angelo who would later become a made member of the Milwaukee family, and a daughter named Antonina. and in the late 1950s, Antonina Alioto married a young, ambitious, educated mobster named Frank Peter Balistrieri. This marriage wasn't just a union of two people. It was a merger of power, a consolidation of two of Milwaukee's most connected Sicilian families. And it meant that when the time came for John Alioto to retire, Frank Balistrieri would be perfectly positioned to take control. Alioto's reign from 1952 to 1961 was marked by growth and stability. The Milwaukee Mafia's relationship with organized labor expanded dramatically during this period. The Teamsters Union, with its control over trucking and shipping, became increasingly infiltrated by mob influence. Loan sharking operations expanded. The vending machine business became a cash cow, with Alioto's people controlling placement in bars, restaurants, and businesses throughout Wisconsin. Perhaps most importantly, Alioto introduced something called the Saja, a leadership panel designed to resolve disputes within the family, a form of internal arbitration that could prevent the kind of chaos that had led to Ferrara's downfall. But Alioto's time wasn't without violence. In 1954, John Di Trapani, a relative and godson of the deposed Sam Ferrara, decided to make a play for power. Along with Frank Lo Galbo and Jack Enia, Di Trapani plotted to seize control of the family from Alioto. It was rebellion, mutiny, and in the Mafia, such actions carry only one penalty. The rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency. On March 18, 1954, John Di Trapani was found shot to death in his car. 19 months later, on November 29, 1955, Jack Enia's body was discovered in a ditch in Waukesha County, riddled with bullets. Lo Galbo, seeing the writing on the wall, survived by transferring out of the Milwaukee family into a Chicago outfit crew in Chicago Heights, though he continued to live in Milwaukee under the outfit's protection. The message was clear. Alioto's leadership would not be challenged, and Chicago backed him completely. During these years, John Alioto did something remarkable for a mafia boss. He left almost no trace for law enforcement. The FBI knew he was running the organization. They had informants, they had suspicions, they conducted surveillance, but they could never make a case against him. In all his years in Milwaukee, Alioto was confronted by police exactly once. On July 2, 1957, he was given a $5 citation for failing to yield the right-of-way while leaving a parking spot. That was it. No arrests, no indictments, no prison time. For a man who controlled a criminal organization for nearly a decade, it was an astounding achievement, a testament to how carefully he operated and how deeply he understood the importance of staying in the shadows. But by 1961, Alioto was ready to step back. He was in his early 70s and the underworld was changing. A new generation was coming up, men who were more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more connected to the expanding opportunities in Las Vegas and other cities. The man groomed to succeed him was his son-in-law, Frank Balistrieri. Yet FBI reports suggest that Alioto may have had reservations about this succession. Some say those reservations stemmed from Frank's reputation for ruthlessness, his autocratic style, his tendency to demand absolute loyalty and use violence to enforce it. Others suggest the reason was more personal. Frank Balistrieri had reportedly been involved in an extramarital affair, a betrayal of Alioto's daughter that couldn't have sat well with a man who valued family above all else. Nevertheless, on December 27, 1961, John Alioto attended a civic ceremony honoring Dr. Vito Gardalabine, the grandson of Milwaukee Mafia founder Vito Gardalabine. It was ostensibly a celebration of the doctor's accomplishments, a social event where Milwaukee's Italian-American community gathered to honor one of their own. But within the underworld, everyone knew what the ceremony really represented. It was Frank Balistrieri's official induction as the new boss of the Milwaukee crime family. The torch had been passed, the dynasty continued, and the most powerful, most feared era of Milwaukee Mafia history was about to begin. Frank Peter Balistrieri was born on May 27, 1918, in Milwaukee to a Sicilian family that had immigrated to America in 1904. From his earliest years, Frank was different from the typical mob soldier. He was educated, having attended college and even spending 6 months in law school. He understood business, economics, and the law, knowledge that would serve him well in building an empire that stretched from Milwaukee's streets to the gambling halls of Las Vegas. As a young man, he started working for the Milwaukee crime family, learning the ropes, making connections, proving himself through the traditional means: collections, enforcement, intimidation when necessary. But Frank Balistrieri had ambition that exceeded the traditional mob rackets. When he became boss in 1961, he already controlled a lucrative loan sharking operation and held a virtual monopoly over illegal sports betting in Milwaukee. He had significant influence in the vending machine business, a racket that would become increasingly important to the family's bottom line. And he had something else, a vision for how to expand the family's wealth and power far beyond what previous bosses had achieved. Balistrieri's first move as boss was controversial but effective. He imposed a street tax on gambling racketeers throughout Milwaukee. If you ran a bookmaking operation, ran a card game, operated a numbers racket, you paid Balistrieri a percentage. This wasn't negotiable, and it wasn't cheap. He also extended the street tax to several legitimate businesses, essentially running a protection racket that generated steady income from establishments that wanted to operate without problems. To enforce this tax, Balistrieri recruited Joseph Guerrera and Sebastian Buster Belstra from Kansas City. These weren't local boys. They were experienced enforcers, men who knew how to make collections and weren't afraid to use violence when business owners refused to pay. This move caused serious discontent within the family for two reasons. First, Balistrieri elevated the newcomer Joseph Guerrera to the rank of Capocina, essentially making him a captain in the organization despite having no roots in Milwaukee. Old-timers who had been with the family for decades were passed over in favor of this outsider, and it rankled. Second, Balistrieri abolished the Saja, the dispute resolution process that John Alioto had implemented. He replaced it with nothing, ruling instead in an autocratic fashion where his word was final and there was no appeal, no panel of equals to settle disagreements. It was a dictatorship, and while dictatorships can be efficient, they also breed resentment. But Balistrieri had insurance against rebellion. His relationship with leaders in the Chicago outfit, particularly Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldericio, was extremely close. Aldericio was a notorious enforcer for Chicago, a man known for his violence and his loyalty to the outfit's leadership. With Aldericio and Chicago backing him, Balistrieri was essentially untouchable by his own men. Any attempt at rebellion would bring Chicago's full weight down on the conspirators, and no one in Milwaukee was willing to risk that. Almost immediately, Balistrieri faced challenges to his authority, though not from within his own family. According to FBI records in 1961, shortly after becoming boss, Balistrieri entered into a feud with Tony Accardo, the same Chicago boss who had helped install John Alioto in 1952. The issue was a murder. Balistrieri had allegedly ordered the killing of a nightclub operator named Izzy Pograb in 1960, before officially becoming boss, and he had done so without getting permission from Accardo. In the mafia's hierarchy, you didn't kill people in or near Chicago's territory without approval from Chicago. It was a fundamental rule, and Balistrieri had broken it. The details of how this feud was resolved remain unclear, but what is known is that Balistrieri survived, remained in power, and continued to expand his operations. By 1963, he met with syndicate members in Chicago and reached an agreement that gave him control over illegal bookmaking operations, not just in Wisconsin, but in northern Illinois as well. It was an expansion of territory, a recognition that Milwaukee under Balistrieri was strong enough, organized enough, and profitable enough to handle operations beyond the city limits. Balistrieri's legitimate businesses provided cover for his criminal empire. He promoted boxing matches, bringing fighters and audiences to Milwaukee venues while using the events to move money and make connections. He distributed coin-operated devices, the vending machines and jukeboxes that would become central to one of the FBI's biggest cases against him. He owned bars and restaurants throughout Milwaukee, establishments that served as meeting places, money laundering operations, and venues for backroom deals. And he owned strip clubs, including one called The Scene, where women danced and men discussed business that had nothing to do with entertainment. But controlling Milwaukee wasn't enough for Frank Balistrieri. His eyes turned west toward the desert, toward the neon lights and the rivers of money flowing through Las Vegas casinos. In the early 1970s, Las Vegas was still largely controlled by mob families from across the country. The casinos weren't yet run by corporations. They were run by men with connections, fronted by seemingly legitimate businessmen, but controlled behind the scenes by mobsters who skimmed millions of dollars in unreported profits before the money ever showed up in official ledgers. This is where the story of Frank Balistrieri truly becomes extraordinary, where a Midwest mob boss from Milwaukee somehow became a central figure in the biggest casino skimming operation in Las Vegas history, where his tentacles reached across state lines and his monthly transfusions of cash made him one of the wealthiest criminals in America. But that story, the story of Las Vegas, of the casinos, of the millions of dollars and the FBI investigation that would ultimately bring down not just Balistrieri but mob bosses from 4 different cities, that story is still unfolding in 1961 as Frank Balistrieri settles into his new role as boss. For now, in those early years of the 1960s, Balistrieri is consolidating power, building relationships, and establishing the reputation that would make him feared across the underworld. He rules Milwaukee with an iron fist, demanding absolute loyalty and responding to betrayal with violence that is swift, brutal, and often explosive. They call him Mr. Big, a nickname that fits his outsized influence. They call him Frankie Bal, a street name that connects him to the neighborhood despite his education and ambition. They call him Mr. Slick, acknowledging his intelligence and his ability to navigate both criminal and legitimate worlds. But there is one other nickname, one that captures the essence of his personality and his preferred method of dealing with enemies, a nickname that would come to define him in the darkest moments of his reign. They call him the Mad Bomber. And in Milwaukee during the 1960s and 1970s, that name isn't just for show. Frank Balistrieri uses car bombs as weapons, attaching explosives to vehicles and detonating them remotely, turning automobiles into death traps that kill instantly and send unmistakable messages to anyone considering crossing him. It is terrorism in the truest sense, a tactic designed not just to eliminate individuals but to create fear, to make people wonder if their car will explode when they turn the ignition, to paralyze opposition through the constant threat of sudden, violent death. Even mobsters from other cities talk about Milwaukee with a mixture of fear and respect. In 1978, when undercover FBI agent Joseph Pistone, working as Donnie Brasco in New York, tried to introduce Milwaukee undercover agent Gail Cobb to Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero, a soldier in the Bonanno crime family, Ruggiero's response was immediate and alarmed. "He's crazy," Ruggiero said about Cobb's plan to operate a vending business in Milwaukee. "Doesn't the guy know you can't operate a vending business without connections, especially Milwaukee? They're crazy out there. It ain't like New York where they may just throw you a beating to chase you out. Out there they're vicious. They answer to Chicago, they blow people up." That assessment came from a New York mobster, a man who had seen plenty of violence in one of the most dangerous cities in America, and even he was scared of Milwaukee. Even he understood that Frank Balistrieri operated on a different level, with a willingness to use explosive violence that surpassed the typical mob enforcement methods. In New York, they might beat you up. In Milwaukee, you might not get a warning. You might just turn your car key one morning and cease to exist in a fireball of gasoline and shrapnel. But who were these victims? Who felt the wrath of the Mad Bomber during Balistrieri's reign? The full list will never be known because many of the deaths attributed to Balistrieri were never proven, never prosecuted, never officially connected to him, despite FBI suspicions and witness statements. What is known paints a picture of a boss who did not tolerate disrespect, disloyalty, or competition. By the 1960s, the FBI had managed to plant several informants within the Milwaukee Mafia. Joseph Guerrera, the Kansas City enforcer that Balistrieri had promoted to captain, was one. August Augie Maniasai was another. Maniasai came from one of the founding families of the Milwaukee mob, remember Nunzio Maniasai, who arrived in 1902 and married into a political family with Giovanni Battista Gardalabine as his best man. 3 of Nunzio's 10 sons had joined the Milwaukee organization, and August was one of them. For Augie Maniasai to become an FBI informant was a betrayal that cut to the core of the organization's history. On September 11, 1975, August Maniasai was shot and killed outside his home on Milwaukee's East Side. The official story was that he had been feuding with Frank Balistrieri, though the exact nature of the feud was never made public. What was clear was that Maniasai's cooperation with the FBI had become known, and in the Mafia, there is only one punishment for informants. His brother Vincent survived an attempted car bombing in August 1977 when 20 sticks of dynamite attached to his Buick Electra failed to explode. Vincent Maniasai, understanding that Milwaukee had become too dangerous for him, fled to Honolulu and never returned, but the violence went beyond dealing with informants. On August 1, 1978, August Palmisano, a convicted gambler and reputed Milwaukee mobster who was also suspected of being an informant, was killed in a car bombing. Authorities immediately attributed the bombing to Frank Balistrieri, though he was never charged. The pattern was clear. If you talked to the feds, if you cooperated in any way, if you were even suspected of being an informant, you might end up dead, and there was a good chance it would involve explosives. Even Balistrieri's personal life was marked by violence and control. In March 1967, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison in Minnesota. It was his first major conviction, a crack in the armor, a sign that federal authorities were building cases against him. While he served his time, his younger brother Peter Balistrieri took over as acting boss, keeping the organization running smoothly. Frank was released in June 1971, returning to Milwaukee to find his empire intact and ready to expand further. The education Frank Balistrieri had received, the law school training, the understanding of economics and business, all of it served him well in evading law enforcement for as long as he did. He knew how to structure deals to minimize his personal exposure. He used intermediaries, front companies, and layers of insulation between himself and the actual criminal acts. He was careful on the phone, often speaking in code, referring to money as transfusions, and using nicknames instead of real names. But the FBI was patient, and by the mid-1970s, they were building a case that would eventually bring down not just Balistrieri but mob operations across the Midwest. Yet in the early 1970s, as Frank Balistrieri entered his 50s, he was at the height of his power. He controlled Milwaukee absolutely. He had influence in Chicago, Kansas City, and connections to New York through deals and partnerships. He was about to become involved in the biggest criminal enterprise of his life, a scheme so audacious, so profitable, that it would make him millions of dollars and eventually lead to his downfall. But that story, the story of Las Vegas, of Alan Glick and the Argent Corporation, of the Stardust and Fremont casinos, of the millions of dollars skimmed and distributed to mob families across America, that story deserves its own telling. The connection between Milwaukee and Las Vegas began on a spring day in 1974, in a room where powerful men gathered to discuss money, power, and opportunity. On March 20, Frank Balistrieri flew to Las Vegas and met with Nicholas Civella, the boss of the Kansas City crime family, and Carl DeLuna, a trusted Kansas City mobster. The subject of their discussion was a 32-year-old Vietnam War veteran and real estate developer from San Diego named Alan Glick. Alan Glick was everything a mob front man needed to be. He had graduated from law school at Case Western Reserve, served honorably in Vietnam earning a Bronze Star and 3 Combat Air Medals, and had built a legitimate career in real estate development. On paper, he was clean, successful, ambitious, and utterly respectable. He was also desperate for money to expand his business empire, and that desperation made him vulnerable to the kind of help that came with invisible strings attached. Glick wanted to buy casinos in Las Vegas, not small operations, but major properties, the kind that required tens of millions of dollars in financing that traditional banks wouldn't provide to someone without a substantial track record in the gaming industry. That's where the mob came in. Through their control of the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, organized crime families across the Midwest had access to enormous pools of money that could be loaned out with minimal oversight to friends, to associates, and to men who were willing to play by certain rules, even if they claimed not to know who was making them. During that March 1974 meeting, Balistrieri, Civella, and DeLuna made Alan Glick an offer. They would help him secure a loan from the Teamsters Pension Fund, enough money to buy the casinos he wanted. In exchange, Glick would do something seemingly simple. He would give Frank Balistrieri's 2 sons, Joseph and John, an option to purchase part of the Argent Corporation, the holding company Glick was creating to control his casino empire. The price for this option was laughably low, just $25,000 for what would become a stake in a company worth millions. It wasn't a business deal. It was a tribute, a payment for services rendered, and a contract signed in invisible ink that bound Alan Glick to Frank Balistrieri and the network of mob families behind him. 2 months later, Glick got what he wanted. In June 1974, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund approved a loan of $62.75 million to Alan Glick. It was one of the largest loans the pension fund had ever made, and it happened with remarkable speed considering Glick's limited experience in the casino industry. With that money, Glick purchased the Stardust and Fremont casinos in Las Vegas, and shortly after, he added the Hacienda and Marina properties to his portfolio. Argent Corporation, named using Glick's initials, Alan R. Glick Enterprises, now controlled 4 major Las Vegas casinos, but Glick wasn't really in control. In October 1974, just months after the purchase, Glick made another critical decision. He hired a man named Frank Rosenthal as his executive consultant at the Stardust. Rosenthal, whose nickname was Lefty because he was left-handed, was a professional sports gambler from Chicago with deep connections to the Chicago outfit. He was brilliant with numbers, understood gambling better than almost anyone in the country, and had a vision for transforming the Stardust into one of Las Vegas's premier gambling destinations. He was also a convicted criminal who couldn't legally obtain a Nevada gaming license, which is exactly why he was hired as a consultant instead of an official casino executive. The job title didn't matter. Everyone who mattered knew that Frank Rosenthal, not Alan Glick, was running the Stardust. In November 1974, the skimming operation began. Skimming is a simple concept with complex execution. Every casino counts its money in special rooms, protected vaults where cash from slot machines and gaming tables is tallied before being reported to Nevada gaming authorities. The state taxes casino revenue, so every dollar reported means a percentage goes to the government. Skimming means taking cash before it gets counted, before it goes into the books, before the state ever knows it existed. It's pure profit, untaxed and unreported money that flows directly into the pockets of whoever controls the operation. At the Stardust, the man in charge of the skim was Jay Vandermark, the slot machine manager. Vandermark had been brought in by Rosenthal specifically for this purpose. His job was to skim money from the slot machines, particularly the high-volume machines that processed thousands of dollars in quarters, dollars, and tokens every single day. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of accurately recording how much money the machines produced, Vandermark and his team would take cash off the top, usually at night when fewer eyes were watching, and replace it with false receipts or simply underreport the actual take. The money went into bags, the bags went into cars, and the cars drove to secure locations where the cash was counted and prepared for distribution. By conservative estimates, between $7 and $15 million was skimmed from Argent Corporation casinos between 1974 and 1976. The real number was probably higher because skimming operations don't keep official ledgers and participants have every reason to underreport totals. That money didn't stay in Las Vegas. It was transported to Chicago where it was counted again, divided according to predetermined percentages, and then distributed by armed couriers to mob bosses in 4 cities: Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. Frank Balistrieri's share came monthly, delivered by trusted couriers who understood that missing even one payment meant consequences too severe to contemplate. The amounts varied, but FBI wiretaps and informant testimony later revealed that Balistrieri was receiving regular transfusions of cash from the Las Vegas operations, money that required no investment, no risk of his own capital, just the connections and influence he had used to help Alan Glick secure that original Teamsters loan. For Balistrieri, the Las Vegas skim represented the pinnacle of organized crime achievement. He wasn't robbing banks or running illegal gambling games. He was extracting money from legitimate casinos owned by a seemingly legitimate businessman, all while sitting in Milwaukee conducting business from his table at Snug's restaurant in the Shorecrest Hotel. That red telephone on Balistrieri's table wasn't just for show. It was his lifeline to the empire, the instrument through which he conducted business, gave orders, and maintained control over operations that stretched from Milwaukee's streets to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas. People who did business with Balistrieri knew the routine. You called ahead, you waited for permission, you showed up at Snug's at the appointed time, and you sat across from Mr. Big while he decided your fate over lunch. It was theater, performance art, a demonstration of power that required no violence because everyone understood what Frank Balistrieri was capable of if you crossed him. But Las Vegas was making everyone nervous, including the bosses in Chicago who technically controlled Milwaukee's operations and had final say over major decisions. Frank Rosenthal was becoming a problem. Despite his brilliance as a casino operator, he had installed the Stardust's revolutionary sportsbook that became a model for the entire industry, and he had implemented policies like hiring female blackjack dealers that doubled revenue. Rosenthal couldn't keep a low profile. He started hosting a television show broadcast from the Stardust, bringing in celebrity guests like Frank Sinatra and O.J. Simpson, making himself a public figure in a world that demanded shadows and silence. Rosenthal also got into a public battle with Nevada gaming regulators. In 1976, when authorities discovered that Rosenthal was essentially running 4 casinos without a state gaming license, they held hearings to determine whether he could be licensed. The chairman of those hearings was Harry Reid, who would later become the U.S. Senate Majority Leader. Reid and Rosenthal clashed repeatedly during the proceedings, with Rosenthal arguing that his work was purely consultative and that he wasn't actually running the casinos. Nobody believed him. The Nevada Gaming Commission denied his license application, citing his criminal record and his documented associations with organized crime figures, particularly his childhood friendship with Anthony Spilatro, the Chicago outfit's enforcer in Las Vegas. Spilatro, known as Tony the Ant, was the mob's muscle in Vegas, running the outfit's street operations while Rosenthal handled the casinos. But Spilatro was also sleeping with Rosenthal's wife, Jerry, a former showgirl and prostitute who had married Lefty in 1969. The affair created tension that went beyond personal betrayal. It was a violation of mob protocol, a sign that the Chicago operation in Las Vegas was becoming messy, personal, and dangerous. Meanwhile, the skimming operation was becoming more sophisticated but also more vulnerable to detection. At the Fremont Casino, another Argent property, similar operations were underway. Money flowed from count rooms to couriers, from Las Vegas to Chicago to the 4 Midwestern cities whose bosses had invested in and protected the operation. The Chicago outfit, under boss Joseph Ayuppa and underboss Jackie Cerrone, took a 25% tax off the top of everything skimmed, their commission for facilitating and protecting the scheme. What remained was divided according to agreements made between Civella, Balistrieri, and Cleveland mob figures, but cooperation was breaking down. Balistrieri and Civella began feuding over their respective shares. Both men felt they deserved more, both believed the other was holding back, and tensions escalated to the point where they requested arbitration from the outfit. The ruling came down from Ayuppa and Cerrone. Everyone would continue to pay Chicago their 25%, and the remaining percentages would stay as originally agreed. Neither Balistrieri nor Civella was happy, but you didn't argue with Chicago, not if you wanted to stay in business or stay alive. Balistrieri blamed Frank Rosenthal for his problems. According to FBI wiretaps, Balistrieri believed that Rosenthal was not only drawing too much attention to the operations, but also possibly skimming from the skim itself, taking more than his share before the money ever left Las Vegas. Whether this was true or paranoia doesn't matter. What matters is that Frank Balistrieri, the Mad Bomber, was furious with Lefty Rosenthal, and when Balistrieri was furious, bombs tended to follow. In May 1976, Nevada gaming authorities discovered the skimming operation. The investigation began with irregularities in slot machine revenue at the Stardust, discrepancies that couldn't be explained by normal variance or operational losses. State auditors launched a comprehensive review of Argent Corporation's counting room procedures, and what they found was damning. Money was disappearing systematically, millions of dollars that should have shown up in revenue reports but never did. Jay Vandermark, the slot machine manager, became the focus of the investigation. When authorities tried to question him, Vandermark disappeared. He fled to Mexico, then reportedly to Costa Rica, always staying one step ahead of subpoenas and arrest warrants. In October 1976, Vandermark vanished completely. His body was never found, but everyone in the underworld knew what had happened. Dead men can't testify. Alan Glick, sitting in his executive office at the Stardust, maintained that he knew nothing about the skimming. He claimed ignorance, shock, and betrayal when authorities informed him that his casinos had been systematically looted for over 2 years. Whether he was truly ignorant or willfully blind is a question that was never definitively answered. What is known is that Glick became a government witness, cooperating with federal authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He would later testify before grand juries about the Teamsters loan, about his meetings with Balistrieri and Civella, about the secret agreement that had given Balistrieri's sons an option to purchase part of Argent Corporation. His testimony was crucial, but it also made him a marked man. In November 1975, before the skimming was even discovered, a woman named Tamara Rand was murdered in her home in San Diego. Rand had loaned Alan Glick $500,000 to help fund his purchase of Argent Corporation, and she claimed that entitled her to a 5% ownership share. When she pressed her claim, arguing in court that Glick owed her not just repayment but equity in what had become a multi-million-dollar casino empire, she was shot 5 times with a silencer-equipped .22 caliber gun. The hit was professional, clean, efficient. Tamara Rand's murder was never officially solved, but the timing and method suggested organized crime involvement. She had become a problem, a loose end, someone who could potentially expose the mob's hidden ownership of Argent, and problems like that got eliminated. By 1978, Alan Glick was exhausted. Federal and state investigations were intensifying. The Nevada Gaming Control Board was conducting raids and audits. The FBI had begun electronic surveillance of multiple mob figures. On June 8, 1978, the FBI executed a massive operation in Las Vegas, sending 50 agents with 83 search warrants to raid Argent properties and associated businesses. They seized documents, financial records, wiretap equipment, anything that could provide evidence of the skimming conspiracy. Alan Glick, watching his empire collapse, announced that he would lease out and eventually sell the Stardust and Fremont casinos. He was done with Las Vegas, done with the mob, done with the nightmare that had begun with what seemed like a simple business opportunity 4 years earlier. Kansas City mob boss Nick Savella had other ideas. According to testimony that would later emerge, Savella met with Glick and delivered an ultimatum: sell the casinos immediately and sell them to buyers approved by the Kansas City mob. If Glick refused, if he delayed, if he tried to cooperate too openly with authorities, Savella would kill Glick's sons, not Glick himself. That would be too obvious, too direct. But his children would be murdered one by one until Glick complied. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a death threat delivered with cold precision by a man who had ordered countless murders and would not hesitate to kill children if business required it. Glick sold. In December 1979, Argent Corporation was purchased by Trans-Sterling Corporation, another company with alleged mob ties. Glick walked away, returned to San Diego, and spent the next 40 years looking over his shoulder, wondering if the mob would ever decide that his cooperation with authorities warranted permanent silencing. He died in 2021 at age 79, having survived longer than most people who knew as much as he did about the Midwest mob's operations in Las Vegas. But selling the casinos didn't end the skimming. Under new ownership, Kansas City continued to share in the proceeds without interference, a testament to how deeply organized crime had penetrated the Las Vegas gaming industry. The money kept flowing until 1983, when federal indictments finally brought down the entire operation. The investigation that cracked the case open was called Operation Strawman, named after the strawmen, front men like Alan Glick, who posed as legitimate casino owners while actually serving mob interests. It began not in Las Vegas but in Kansas City, in May 1978, when FBI agents received a tip that a Kansas City mob associate was marked for death. Hoping to prevent the murder, agents obtained court permission to wiretap telephones of Kansas City mob bosses. The murder couldn't be prevented. The victim was killed before agents could intervene, but the wiretaps revealed something far bigger than a single killing. FBI agents, listening to recordings of conversations at the Villa Capri restaurant in Kansas City, where mob figures met at a back table to conduct business, heard discussions about Las Vegas. Millions of dollars. Casino operations, distribution of money to Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, names like Agosto, Rosenthal, Balistrieri, Ayapa. The agents realized they had stumbled onto the largest organized crime conspiracy in Las Vegas history. The investigation expanded rapidly. Wiretaps were installed on phones across Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Chicago. FBI agents posed as businessmen, set up fake companies, and infiltrated mob-controlled industries. They recorded thousands of hours of conversations, documenting not just the skimming operations, but the entire structure of how 4 crime families coordinated to control Las Vegas casinos. It was the first time the FBI had successfully penetrated the mob's Las Vegas operations on this scale, the first time they could prove that an umbrella organization spanning multiple cities was systematically stealing from casinos and dividing the proceeds. In Milwaukee, the FBI launched a parallel operation targeting Frank Balistrieri's control over the vending machine business. In 1977, Special Agent Joseph Pistone, who was already working undercover in New York as Donnie Brasco infiltrating the Bonanno crime family, came to Milwaukee to help set up a sting operation. Another undercover agent, Gail Cobb, posed as a vending machine businessman using the alias Tony Kant. The plan was simple but dangerous: establish a vending business in Milwaukee without asking permission from Frank Balistrieri, then wait to see how he would respond. Benjamin Ruggiero, a Bonanno family soldier who knew Pistone as Donnie Brasco, agreed to introduce Cobb to Milwaukee contacts for a fee. When Ruggiero learned the plan involved operating in Milwaukee, his reaction was immediate alarm. "He's crazy," Ruggiero told Pistone. "Doesn't the guy know you can't operate a vending business without connections, especially Milwaukee? They're crazy out there. It ain't like New York, where they may just throw you a beating to chase you out. Out there they're vicious. They answer to Chicago. They blow people up." The fear in Ruggiero's voice was real. A New York mobster, a man who had committed murder and witnessed countless violent acts, was terrified of Milwaukee. That reputation, that fear, was Frank Balistrieri's greatest weapon, more powerful than guns or knives or even the car bombs that had earned him the Mad Bomber nickname. But Cobb proceeded anyway, setting up his vending business and waiting for Balistrieri to make contact. The meeting happened at Snug's restaurant. Frank Balistrieri, flanked by his two sons Joseph and John, sat across from the undercover agents and laid out the terms. The vending business wasn't theirs, it belonged to the Balistrieris now. Cobb would become a silent partner, providing a legitimate front while the Balistrieri family controlled operations and took the majority of profits. Cobb agreed, recording everything, gathering evidence that would later be used in court. At one point during the negotiations, Balistrieri laughingly admitted that he had been getting ready to murder the men before realizing a partnership would be more profitable. It was said casually, almost as a joke, but nobody in that room doubted it was true. On October 9, 1983, Frank Balistrieri was convicted in federal court on 5 illegal gambling and tax evasion charges related to a sports betting ring that had grossed at least $2,000 per day from 1977 to 1980. The investigation had included wiretapping the Shorecrest Hotel, where Balistrieri's son Joseph was part owner, and a dramatic raid on Balistrieri's house, where FBI agents used a sledgehammer to knock down the front door. While awaiting sentencing, Balistrieri maintained his innocence to the press, offering a quote that would become infamous. "The first time I heard the word mafia was when I read it in the newspapers." On April 11, 1984, Frank Balistrieri and his sons John and Joseph were convicted in federal court in Green Bay, Wisconsin, of attempted extortion and conspiracy to commit extortion in the vending machine case. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with voluminous evidence presented showing how the Balistrieris had forced Cobb to accept them as secret partners through threats and intimidation. On May 29, 1984, Frank Balistrieri was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison and fined $30,000. His sons each received 8 years, later reduced to 5, and both were disbarred from practicing law. But the biggest case was still pending. In September 1983, 15 major organized crime figures were indicted in connection with Operation Strawman, charged with conspiring to skim more than $2 million from the Stardust and Fremont casinos. The indictment was historic, the first time federal authorities had successfully connected mobsters from 4 different cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Cleveland, in a single criminal conspiracy. Among those indicted were Joseph Ayapa and Jackie Cerrone, the top leaders of the Chicago outfit, Anthony Spilatro, the mob's enforcer in Las Vegas, Frank Balistrieri and his sons, Nicholas Savella of Kansas City, and multiple other high-ranking mob figures. The trial began in Kansas City in September 1985. 9 defendants were being tried together in what would become one of the most important organized crime prosecutions in American history. Frank Balistrieri, already serving time for his gambling and extortion convictions, was brought from prison to face charges that he had helped coordinate the skimming operation and had received a share of the stolen money. The government's case was built on wiretap recordings, testimony from cooperating witnesses including Alan Glick, financial records seized in raids, and thousands of pages of FBI surveillance reports. On December 31, 1985, facing overwhelming evidence and deteriorating health, Frank Balistrieri pleaded guilty to 2 counts of racketeering conspiracy in exchange for the government dropping other federal charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, to run concurrently with his 13-year sentence from 1984. His sons John and Joseph were acquitted in the Kansas City case, saved from conviction by their father's plea deal, which had been negotiated partly to shield them from additional prison time. The Strawman investigation and subsequent trials resulted in the convictions of 19 senior mobsters, virtually eliminating the leadership of organized crime families in Milwaukee, Chicago, and Kansas City. It was a devastating blow to the American mafia, proof that the FBI's use of electronic surveillance, undercover operations, and multi-jurisdictional cooperation could penetrate even the most secretive criminal organizations. But there was one moment during the Strawman period that captured more public attention than any trial testimony or conviction. On October 4, 1982, Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal walked out of Tony Roma's restaurant in Las Vegas carrying takeout food. He got into his 1981 Cadillac Eldorado in the parking lot and inserted the key into the ignition. As he turned the key, flames erupted from the defroster vent. Rosenthal looked down and saw fire spreading through the interior of his car. He struggled with the door, pulling the handle as sheets of flame engulfed the vehicle. Outside, witnesses heard an explosion that one described as sounding like a train falling from the sky. The 4,000-pound Cadillac jumped several feet into the air, flames shooting through the roof 2 stories high. The gas tank exploded. Fire and smoke filled the parking lot. Frank Rosenthal rolled on the ground, his clothes burning, putting out the flames with help from 2 bystanders. He was rushed to Sunrise Hospital with minor burns on both legs, his left arm, and the left side of his face. When police arrived and tried to take his statement, Rosenthal refused to sign a crime report or discuss the matter with investigators. When witnesses asked who was trying to kill him, Rosenthal refused to say anything. He knew. Everyone in the underworld knew, but you don't talk to cops, not even when someone has just tried to blow you into pieces. Investigators later determined that a bomb had been attached to the car's gasoline tank, designed to detonate when the ignition was turned. Frank Rosenthal survived because of a metal plate General Motors had installed beneath the driver's seat of 1981 Cadillac Eldorados to correct a balancing problem. That plate, placed there for engineering reasons having nothing to do with security, deflected the blast downward and outward instead of up through the driver. It was pure luck, an accident of automotive design that saved Rosenthal's life. Who planted the bomb? The case was never officially solved, remaining one of the great mysteries of Las Vegas mob history, alongside the murder of Bugsy Siegel and the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. But FBI wiretaps provided strong clues. Frank Balistrieri, already in prison at the time, had been recorded on wiretaps blaming Rosenthal for the legal problems afflicting mob-controlled casinos. Balistrieri, known as the Mad Bomber, had told his sons just weeks before the bombing that he intended to get full satisfaction for Rosenthal's perceived wrongdoing. Kansas City mobsters had also been recorded on FBI wiretaps calling Rosenthal crazy and expressing frustration with his high-profile antics that were drawing attention to the skimming operations. The most likely scenario, according to investigators, was that the car bomb was ordered by Milwaukee, approved by Kansas City and Chicago, and carried out by professionals who understood explosives. The message was clear. Frank Rosenthal had become a liability, and liabilities got eliminated. That Rosenthal survived was either fortunate for him or unfortunate for those who wanted him silenced. Either way, Lefty got the message. He left Las Vegas within 6 months, moved to California, and spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. He was later placed in Nevada's Black Book in 1987, formally banning him from entering any casino in the state. Rosenthal died of a heart attack in 2008, having outlived most of the men who wanted him dead. Frank Balistrieri, imprisoned in federal facilities in multiple states during the late 1980s and early 1990s, missed out on an opportunity that had been tantalizingly close. According to FBI reports and informant testimony, Balistrieri had been on track to achieve a seat on the Mafia Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia that included bosses from the most powerful families. For a Milwaukee boss to be considered for the commission was extraordinary, a recognition of how much power and influence Balistrieri had accumulated through the Las Vegas operations and his decades of control over Milwaukee's underworld. But prison sentences thwarted that ambition. You can't sit on the commission from behind bars, and by the time Balistrieri was released, the opportunity had passed. His health deteriorating, Balistrieri was released from prison in November 1991. He had served approximately 7 years of his combined sentences, earning early release due to medical issues including heart problems. he returned to Milwaukee, a city that had changed dramatically during his absence. The Third Ward, where his family's criminal empire had begun under Vito Gardalabi nearly 90 years earlier, had been gentrified. The interstate highway system had carved through the old Italian neighborhood. Most of the families had moved to the suburbs. The mob's traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, were being squeezed by federal prosecution and changing economics. During Frank Balistrieri's imprisonment, his younger brother Peter had served as acting boss, keeping the family operations running but at a much reduced level. The Strawman convictions had decimated the leadership not just in Milwaukee but across the Midwest. Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland, all had lost their top bosses and experienced mobsters. The era of mob control over Las Vegas was finished. Corporate gaming companies were buying up the casinos, bringing in professional management, installing sophisticated surveillance and accounting systems that made skimming virtually impossible. The river of money that had flowed from Vegas to the Midwest had been permanently dammed. Frank Balistrieri, the man who had once been called the most powerful man in Milwaukee, who had controlled the city's underworld for over 30 years, who had earned the fear and respect of mobsters from New York to California, now lived quietly in Milwaukee. His empire was gone, his health was failing, the world had moved on. In December 1992, Balistrieri was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital in Milwaukee for colon surgery. He never fully recovered. On February 7, 1993, Frank Peter Balistrieri died at age 74. The cause of death was listed as heart-related complications, a natural end for a man who had survived countless attempts on his life, who had ordered murders and bombings, who had built and lost a criminal empire. His funeral was attended by family, by old associates who remembered the glory days, by a few brave souls willing to be seen paying respects to a man whose reputation still carried weight even in death. There were no floral arrangements from other mob families, no delegations from Chicago or Kansas City, no elaborate ceremonies. Frank Balistrieri was buried quietly, his obituary in Milwaukee newspapers mentioning his business ventures and his family, but carefully avoiding any reference to his criminal career. The Milwaukee crime family he left behind struggled to survive. His son Joseph Balistrieri Sr. allegedly took over as boss, but the organization was a shadow of what it had been. The main members were aging or imprisoned. The next generation wasn't interested in the life, or if they were interested, they lacked the connections and opportunities that had made their fathers wealthy. Chicago, seeing Milwaukee's weakness, began absorbing its operations, taking control of whatever gambling and loan sharking still existed in Wisconsin. By the early 2000s, the Milwaukee Mafia as an independent organization had essentially ceased to exist. Some members remained active, some crews still operated, but the family structure that had existed for nearly a century had collapsed. The last significant mob prosecution in Milwaukee occurred in the late 1990s, and even that case involved relatively minor figures engaging in small-scale crimes that would have been beneath Frank Balistrieri's notice in his prime. The scene of Frank Rosenthal's car bombing, that Tony Roma's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue, closed in 2014. The building sat vacant until 2016, when it was transformed into a hustler Hollywood adult store. History has a sense of irony. The site where one of the most dramatic attempted mob hits in Las Vegas history occurred, where flames shot 2 stories high, and a man miraculously survived through an accident of engineering, now sells lingerie and novelties to tourists who have no idea what happened in that parking lot decades earlier. The Stardust Casino, where millions of dollars were skimmed and where Frank Rosenthal revolutionized the sports betting industry, was imploded on March 13, 2007. The demolition took just 32 seconds, reducing one of Las Vegas's iconic properties to rubble to make way for new development. The site remains empty as of today, a vacant lot on the Las Vegas Strip where the Echelon project was announced but never completed. Alan Glick, the strawman whose naivete or willful blindness had enabled the entire skimming operation, lived out his life in San Diego working in real estate and other business ventures. He gave occasional interviews about his time in Las Vegas, always maintaining that he had been an unwitting pawn of organized crime rather than a willing participant. He cooperated with authorities investigating mob control of Las Vegas, testifying before grand juries, and providing information that helped secure convictions. In August 2021, Alan Glick died at age 79 after a long battle with cancer, having survived the mob's threats and outlived most of the gangsters he had dealt with. The story of Frank Balistrieri and the Milwaukee Mafia's involvement in Las Vegas represents the peak and the fall of traditional organized crime in America. For a brief period in the 1970s, Midwest mob families controlled some of the most lucrative casinos in the world, extracting millions of dollars and distributing it to bosses in multiple cities. It was organized crime at its most sophisticated, a conspiracy that spanned state lines, involved dozens of participants, and generated enough money to make everyone involved wealthy beyond their wildest expectations. But it couldn't last. The FBI's use of electronic surveillance, undercover operations, and RICO statutes, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act passed in 1970, gave federal prosecutors tools that the mob couldn't counter. Wiretaps recorded conversations that had previously happened in complete security. Undercover agents penetrated organizations that had been impenetrable. Prosecutors could now charge entire organizations as criminal enterprises rather than having to prove individual crimes, making it far easier to secure convictions against high-ranking mob figures. The Strawman investigation marked a turning point. After those convictions, the American Mafia never recovered its influence in Las Vegas. Corporate ownership, regulatory oversight, and sophisticated security systems made it nearly impossible for organized crime to operate in the city's casinos. Some mob figures remained in Vegas, running street rackets and traditional crimes, but the era of hidden mob ownership of major casinos was finished. Frank Balistrieri's legacy in Milwaukee is complicated. To some, he was a ruthless criminal who used violence and intimidation to control a city, who ordered murders, who planted bombs that killed and maimed, who extracted tribute from legitimate businesses and destroyed anyone who challenged him. To others, particularly within the Italian-American community that had both supported and feared him, Balistrieri was a product of his time and circumstances, a man who operated within a system that had existed long before he was born and that provided opportunities unavailable through legitimate channels. What is undeniable is that Frank Balistrieri changed Milwaukee's underworld. Under his leadership, the Milwaukee crime family went from a regional operation controlling local rackets to a significant player in one of the biggest organized crime conspiracies in American history. His connections to Chicago, Kansas City, and Las Vegas elevated Milwaukee's status within the American Mafia. His 32 years as boss, despite multiple prison sentences, demonstrated his ability to maintain power and command loyalty. But Balistrieri's story is also a cautionary tale about ambition and overreach. The Las Vegas operations, which seemed like a perfect crime generating millions of dollars with minimal risk, ultimately brought down not just Balistrieri, but the leadership of organized crime across the Midwest. The very success of the skimming operation, the enormous amounts of money involved, guaranteed that law enforcement would eventually focus its resources on cracking the case. And once the FBI had the evidence, once wiretaps had recorded the conversations and witnesses had testified about the structure and operation, there was no escaping prosecution. The morning of February 8, 1993, Milwaukee woke to news that barely made the front page. Frank Balistrieri, the man who had ruled the city's underworld for over 3 decades, had died the previous day. The obituaries were respectful but brief, mentioning his business ventures and his family while carefully avoiding the years of terror, the murders, the bombings, the millions of dollars stolen from Las Vegas casinos. It was as if the city wanted to forget, wanted to pretend that the mad bomber had never existed, that Milwaukee had always been just a quiet Midwestern town where nothing much happened. But forgetting wasn't that simple. The organization Frank Balistrieri left behind was broken, its leadership decimated by federal prosecutions, its revenue streams severed by law enforcement pressure, its reputation tarnished by cooperation witnesses and FBI informants. His brother Peter Balistrieri, who had served as acting boss during Frank's prison sentences, officially took control of the family in 1993 Amazon, but Peter was never Frank. He lacked the ruthlessness, the vision, the willingness to use explosive violence that had made his older brother feared across America. Peter had been a capable underboss, a loyal lieutenant, but as boss, he was managing decline rather than building an empire. Peter Balistrieri died of natural causes on August 16, 1997 Amazon, just 4 years after his brother. He was 77 years old, and with his death, the direct Balistrieri family control over Milwaukee's underworld ended. The question facing the remaining members was simple but existential: who would lead, and was there even an organization left to lead? The choice fell on Joseph Caminiti, who had served as Frank Balistrieri's consigliere from 1961 until the 1990s fandom. Caminiti was not a Balistrieri by blood, but he was connected by marriage, having wed Mary Alioto, the daughter of former Milwaukee boss John Alioto. His credentials were impeccable in mob terms. He had been a secretary-treasurer of Teamsters Local 257, controlling Milwaukee's garbage removal and gasoline transportation, and had held similar positions in service station attendants' unions. He understood labor racketeering, the traditional bread and butter of organized crime, and he had survived the strawman prosecutions without facing charges. But Caminiti was also in his 70s when he became boss, and the Milwaukee he inherited bore little resemblance to the city Frank Balistrieri had controlled. Under Caminiti's leadership, the family was reportedly composed of no more than 20 made members and 15 to 20 associates, operating primarily in Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin fandom. Compare that to the over 50 made members the Milwaukee family had boasted at its peak, and the decline becomes stark. Law enforcement wasn't even particularly worried about the Milwaukee Mafia anymore. By the 2000s, authorities believed that the Milwaukee family was nearly extinct, with less than 15 made members and the most lucrative rackets controlled by the Chicago outfit fandom. Chicago had always been Milwaukee's overlord, the supreme authority that approved bosses and settled disputes. But now Chicago wasn't just overseeing Milwaukee, it was absorbing it, taking over gambling operations, loan sharking, whatever traditional mob rackets still existed in Wisconsin. The relationship had shifted from supervision to colonization. Milwaukee was becoming a Chicago crew in all but name, a satellite operation run by aging men who remembered better days but couldn't recreate them. Law enforcement claimed that Caminiti shared much of the power with Frank Balistrieri's son Joseph, who died in 2010 fandom. Joseph Balistrieri Sr., known as Joey Bal, had been groomed to succeed his father but had been convicted in the vending machine extortion case and served time in federal prison. After his release, he had tried to maintain some influence in Milwaukee's diminished underworld, working alongside Caminiti to keep the organization functioning. His death in 2010, at age 68, removed one more connection to the family's glory days. With Joseph gone, the Balistrieri name no longer carried operational weight in Milwaukee's criminal world. Joseph Caminiti died on January 30, 2014, at the age of 87 fandom. There are conflicting accounts of what exactly Caminiti's role had been in his final years. Some sources claim he was the undisputed boss until his death. Others suggest that his son, also named Joseph Caminiti, had been confused with his father in mob genealogy, and that the younger Caminiti, who sold life insurance, had little actual involvement in organized crime despite marrying into the Alioto family. The confusion itself speaks to how murky and diminished the Milwaukee Mafia had become. In Frank Balistrieri's era, everyone knew who was boss. By 2014, even law enforcement wasn't entirely sure who was running what was left of the organization. After Caminiti's death, Peter Pixiero, known as Pitch, became boss of the Mob Museum. Pixiero was a blood relative of Frank Balistrieri and the owner of Pitch's Lounge and Restaurant, a Milwaukee establishment that had long been rumored to be a meeting place for remaining mob figures. But Pixiero was 87 years old when he allegedly took over, hardly the age at which men typically rise to leadership positions in criminal organizations. His tenure was brief and largely invisible. Peter Pixiero died of natural causes on January 6, 2024, at the Mob Museum. And then there was John Balistrieri, Frank's younger son. John had never wanted to be a gangster. Unlike his older brother Joseph, who embraced the family business and became deeply involved in his father's operations, John went to Valparaiso University Law School and opened a law practice with his brother WordPress. He was educated, intelligent, and by all accounts, a kind and decent man who happened to have been born into one of America's most notorious crime families. But blood and last name carry obligations in the underworld, and John became a representative of businesses that, according to the FBI, were controlled by his father WordPress. The 1984 extortion conviction destroyed John Balistrieri's legitimate career. He was hit with 8 years imprisonment and was no longer able to run his law practice after being released in April 1989 WordPress. He was disbarred, stripped of the profession he had trained for, and the respectable life he had tried to build separate from his father's reputation. In August 2014, John Balistrieri's application to reinstate his law license was rejected by the Wisconsin Supreme Court Milwaukee Wiki. The court's message was clear: redemption would not be granted, the sins of the father would continue to mark the son, no matter how many years passed or how different John's life had been from Frank's. According to some accounts, John Balistrieri served in a consigliere role for the remnants of the Milwaukee family between 2014 and 2020 for the Mob Museum. Whether this was true or whether it was simply the inevitable association made between anyone named Balistrieri and Milwaukee organized crime is unclear. What is known is that John Joseph Balistrieri died on June 7, 2024, at the age of 75 dBpedia. Friends who attended his funeral spoke of a man very different from the image many had of him. "He was the kindest, nicest man you could ever meet," said Santo Galati, a longtime Friends Chicago Tribune. John Balistrieri's obituary made no mention of the mafia, the convictions, the years in prison, or the father whose shadow he could never escape. It listed his wife Debbie, his son Francesco Joseph, his siblings and extended family. It mentioned that donations could be made to the Neuropathy Institute in his memory. It was the obituary of an ordinary man who had died at a typical age, leaving behind people who loved him. Nothing in those carefully chosen words hinted at the decades of pain, the burden of a name that would forever be synonymous with organized crime in Milwaukee. With John Balistrieri's death, the last direct connection between the modern era and Frank Balistrieri's reign was severed. In 2024, with both boss Peter Pixiero and consigliere John Balistrieri dead, the current status of the Milwaukee family is unknown. The Mob Museum. Most experts believe there simply is no Milwaukee family anymore, at least not as an independent organization. What few remaining members exist likely operate under Chicago's direct control, if they operate at all. The world that allowed the Milwaukee Mafia to flourish for nearly a century has fundamentally changed. The Third Ward, where Vito Gardalabine first established his kingdom in 1903, is now one of Milwaukee's trendiest neighborhoods, filled with art galleries, upscale condos, trendy restaurants, and young professionals who have no idea that their expensive lofts sit where mob bosses once held court. The interstate that carved through the heart of Little Italy in the 1960s destroyed the physical community that had sustained the organization. Our Lady of Pompeii Church, the beautiful pink building where generations of Sicilian immigrants baptized their children and buried their dead, was demolished in 1967. The ethnic enclaves that provided cover and support for organized crime have dispersed into the suburbs, assimilating into mainstream American culture. The economic changes have been just as dramatic. The Teamsters Pension Fund, which provided funding for the Las Vegas casino purchases that made Frank Balistrieri wealthy, came under federal oversight after the Strawman convictions. Labor unions, once easily infiltrated and controlled by mob figures, implemented reforms and government monitoring that made traditional labor racketeering far more difficult. Gambling, the lifeblood of mob income for decades, became legal and regulated in most states. Why risk arrest by placing bets with a mob bookmaker when you can use your phone to legally bet on sports through officially licensed apps? The internet and digital payment systems made loan sharking less profitable, as legitimate online lenders offered high-interest loans to desperate people without requiring broken kneecaps as collection tools. Law enforcement evolved too. The RICO statute, passed in 1970 and used devastatingly effectively in the Strawman prosecutions, allowed prosecutors to charge entire organizations as criminal enterprises. Wiretaps, once illegal and rarely used, became routine investigative tools after court decisions and legislative changes. The FBI, which had been famously slow to acknowledge the existence of the mafia under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, reorganized and prioritized organized crime investigations in the 1970s and 1980s. Asset forfeiture laws let authorities seize property and money connected to criminal activity, depriving mob figures of the wealth that had made them powerful. And then there was cooperation. The Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence that had protected the mafia for generations, crumbled under the weight of long prison sentences and witness protection programs. When faced with spending the rest of their lives in federal prison, men who had sworn blood oaths decided that family and freedom mattered more than loyalty to an organization. The Witness Protection Program, created in 1970, offered a way out, a new identity, relocation, safety from retaliation in exchange for testimony. Alan Glick cooperated. Joseph Guerrera became an FBI informant. August Maniasi was killed for being a suspected informant, but his cooperation helped build cases before his murder. Each defection made the next one easier. Each cooperating witness convinced others that the old code no longer applied. The Las Vegas that Frank Balistrieri helped control is unrecognizable today. Corporate gaming companies like MGM Resorts and Caesars Entertainment own the major casinos, answering to shareholders and regulatory bodies instead of mob bosses in Chicago and Kansas City. Security systems using facial recognition and sophisticated surveillance make skimming nearly impossible. Gaming revenue is tracked digitally, audited constantly, and reported transparently. The mob's presence in Las Vegas hasn't been completely eliminated. There are still isolated cases of mob figures attempting to operate in the city, but the era of hidden mob ownership of major casinos is definitively over. The Stardust, where millions were skimmed and Frank Rosenthal built the sports betting industry, was imploded in 2007. The demolition took 32 seconds, reducing decades of history to rubble. The site where it stood remains an empty lot as of 2024, a vacant space on the Las Vegas Strip where tourists walk past without realizing they're crossing ground, where some of the biggest crimes in American history were planned and executed. The Fremont, the other major casino involved in the skim, still operates downtown, but under completely different ownership and management, its connection to mob history reduced to trivia for true crime enthusiasts. In Milwaukee, the physical remnants of the Balistrieri era have largely disappeared. Snug's restaurant in the Shorecrest Hotel, where Frank Balistrieri held court at his table with his red telephone, is long gone. The Shorecrest itself closed and was converted to other uses. The clubs, bars, and businesses that Balistrieri controlled have changed hands, been demolished, or rebranded so many times that their connections to organized crime have been forgotten by everyone except historians and old-timers who remember when asking the wrong question could get you killed. The Milwaukee Mafia story is, in many ways, a uniquely American tale. It begins with immigrants fleeing poverty and oppression in Sicily, arriving in a new country with nothing but their traditions, their language, and their determination to survive. Some of those immigrants, like Vito Gardalabine, brought with them the structures and codes of the Sicilian Mafia, transplanting old country ways of conducting business to American soil. They built organizations that provided services the legitimate world wouldn't or couldn't provide: protection, loans, arbitration of disputes, and they extracted payment for those services through fear and violence. For generations, these organizations thrived in America's immigrant neighborhoods, filling a void between the promise of American prosperity and the reality of poverty and discrimination faced by new arrivals. The Third Ward wasn't just a haven for criminals. It was a community where people spoke Sicilian, celebrated traditional festivals, and maintained connections to the villages they had left behind. The mob bosses who rose to power in that community weren't viewed as purely criminal by everyone who knew them. To some, they were protectors, benefactors, men who provided jobs and loans when banks wouldn't, who settled disputes when the police couldn't be trusted. The reality was more complicated, darker, involving extortion and murder, and the systematic exploitation of the very communities the bosses claimed to protect. But for decades, enough people in those communities were willing to look the other way, to accept the bad with the good, to value ethnic solidarity over cooperation with outside authorities. Frank Balistrieri represented both the apex and the beginning of the end for this system. He was smarter than most mob bosses, educated in ways that gave him advantages in understanding business and law. He expanded Milwaukee's influence far beyond what anyone could have imagined for a mid-sized family in a mid-sized Midwestern city. His involvement in the Las Vegas casino skimming operations put him in partnership with mob bosses from Chicago, Kansas City, and Cleveland, making Milwaukee a player on the national stage. He accumulated wealth, power, and a reputation that made even New York mobsters nervous, but that very success contained the seeds of destruction. The Las Vegas operations were too big, too profitable, too visible to escape federal attention forever. The violence Balistrieri used to maintain control, the car bombings that earned him the Mad Bomber nickname, terrified people, but also motivated law enforcement to dedicate enormous resources to bringing him down. The education that made him smart also made him arrogant, convinced he could outwit investigators indefinitely. He couldn't, Nobody could, not once the FBI had electronic surveillance, RICO statutes, and cooperating witnesses all working in concert. The tragedy of Frank Balistrieri's life isn't just that he went to prison or that his empire collapsed, it's that he dragged his sons down with him. Joseph and John Balistrieri were both educated young men with legitimate careers ahead of them. Joseph was a lawyer, John was a lawyer, both had opportunities to build lives completely separate from their father's criminal activities. But Frank couldn't resist using them, bringing them into the vending machine business, involving them in schemes that ultimately resulted in their convictions and the destruction of their legitimate futures. Joseph died in 2010, his later years largely unknown, his obituary barely mentioned. John lived until 2024, carrying the burden of his last name and his conviction for 40 years after his release from prison. Friends said he was kind, gentle, nothing like the image people had of a mobster's son. But those friends also knew that John Balistrieri could never fully escape what his father had been, what the name Balistrieri meant in Milwaukee. There's a tendency in American culture to romanticize the mafia, to view mob bosses as Robin Hood figures or folk heroes standing against authority. Movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas, however brilliant as cinema, have contributed to this mythologization. The reality was far uglier. Frank Balistrieri ordered murders. He planted bombs that killed people, turning ignition keys into detonators and cars into coffins. August Maniasci was shot outside his home for cooperating with the FBI. August Pomisano was blown up in his car for the same reason. John Di Trapani and Jack Enia were executed for daring to challenge the boss. Tamara Rand was shot 5 times in her home for asking for money she was legitimately owed. These weren't soldiers killed in gang wars, they were people murdered because they became inconvenient to Frank Balistrieri's business interests. The victims of loan sharking, the business owners forced to pay street taxes, the legitimate vending machine operators driven out of business by mob competition, the casino workers who lost their jobs when Argent properties collapsed under the weight of mob control, all of these people suffered so that Frank Balistrieri and men like him could live well. There is no Robin Hood story here, no noble outlaw fighting against oppression. There is only exploitation, violence, and the destruction of lives in pursuit of money and power. Yet there's also something almost inevitable about how the story unfolded. Vito Gardalabine arrived in America in 1903 with nothing, and within 12 years he was the king of Milwaukee's Little Italy. How did that happen? Because the legitimate world offered Italian immigrants few opportunities, because banks wouldn't loan them money, because police didn't protect their neighborhoods, because the American dream they had been promised wasn't actually available to people who spoke broken English and came from the wrong country. The mafia filled that vacuum, providing services and structure in a world that seemed hostile and foreign. It was criminal, yes, but it was also, in a perverse way, entrepreneurial, identifying needs and meeting them, however brutally. Over time, as Italian immigrants and their children assimilated into American culture, as discrimination decreased and opportunities increased, the need for those services diminished. The mafia became less essential to community survival and more purely parasitic, a criminal organization feeding off neighborhoods that no longer needed its protection or services. That transition, playing out over decades, spelled the organization's doom. When the Third Ward dispersed into the suburbs, when Italian Americans became doctors and lawyers and business owners without needing mob connections, when the community that had tolerated the mafia because they were our criminals stopped seeing them as protectors and started seeing them as predators, the organization lost its foundation. Without a community willing to provide cover, without ethnic enclaves where omerta could be enforced through social pressure, the mob became vulnerable to outside investigation in ways it never had been before. Frank Balistrieri's death in 1993 marked the end of an era not just for Milwaukee but for the American mafia generally. The great mob trials of the 1980s, the Commission case in New York, the Strawman case in Kansas City and Milwaukee, the multiple prosecutions of Chicago outfit leaders, had decimated the organization's leadership across the country. The next generation, men who came of age in the 1990s and 2000s, looked at the long prison sentences their fathers and uncles were serving and made different choices. Some went legitimate, using family connections to build legal businesses. Some cooperated with law enforcement, trading testimony for reduced sentences. A few tried to maintain the old ways, but they were operating in a completely different world, one where electronic surveillance was ubiquitous, where prosecutors had powerful legal tools, where the FBI had made organized crime a top priority. By 2024, the American Mafia still exists, but it's a pale shadow of what it was during Frank Balistrieri's reign. There are still made members, still small-scale operations running gambling or loan sharking or other traditional rackets. But the days of mob families controlling entire cities, of bosses meeting with celebrities and politicians, of casinos being used as personal ATMs for organized crime, those days are gone and won't return. The Milwaukee Mafia specifically has ceased to exist as an independent organization, absorbed by Chicago or simply fading away as members died or retired. What remains is memory, stories, and lessons. Milwaukee remembers Frank Balistrieri, though it would often prefer to forget. The city grew and changed, transforming from an industrial center dependent on brewing and manufacturing to a more diversified economy based on healthcare, services, and technology. The neighborhoods where mob bosses once held absolute power are now filled with people who have no personal memory of that era, who know the stories only as history, if they know them at all. For the families who lived through it, the memory is more complicated. The children and grandchildren of Vito Gardalabine, John Alioto, Frank Balistrieri, they carry names that once meant power and fear, but now mean something else. Some changed their names to escape the association. Others kept their names but built completely legitimate lives, determined to prove that family history doesn't determine personal destiny. A few, like John Balistrieri, spent their entire lives trying to reconcile the decent person they wanted to be with the notorious father they happened to have. The lesson of the Milwaukee Mafia isn't simply that crime doesn't pay, though that's certainly part of it. Frank Balistrieri spent about a decade of his life in prison, died at 74 having watched his organization collapse, and left his sons with criminal records that destroyed their legitimate careers. The more complex lesson is about the American immigrant experience, about how poverty and discrimination create conditions where criminal organizations can thrive, and how social progress and integration eventually eliminate the environment that sustained those organizations. The third ward that existed in 1903, when Vito Gardalabine arrived, was a completely different world from the third ward of 2024. That transformation from ethnic enclave to gentrified neighborhood, from a place where the mafia was necessary and tolerated to a place where it couldn't exist, represents progress. Not perfect progress. Milwaukee still has crime, still has gangs, still has neighborhoods struggling with poverty and violence. But the specific conditions that allowed the Sicilian mafia to establish itself and rule for nearly a century no longer exist. And that's perhaps the most profound epilogue to this story. The Milwaukee Mafia wasn't defeated purely by law enforcement, though the FBI played a crucial role. It was defeated by time, by assimilation, by the success of the very people it claimed to protect. When Italian immigrants became Italian Americans, when their children went to college and became professionals, when the Third Ward dispersed and the tight-knit community that had sustained the organization broke apart, the Mafia lost its reason for existence. It became, in the end, exactly what law enforcement had always said it was, a criminal organization exploiting people, not protecting them. Frank Balistrieri understood this on some level, though he could never have admitted it. In his final years, released from prison and living quietly in Milwaukee, he watched a city that had moved on without him. The businesses he had controlled were gone or under new ownership. The men who had taken orders from him were dead, imprisoned, or retired. His sons were ex-convicts trying to rebuild lives. The mob families from Chicago, Kansas City, and Cleveland that he had partnered with were decimated by prosecutions. Las Vegas had been corporatized, stripped of mob influence, transformed into a legitimate gaming industry that generated billions in tax revenue for Nevada. What did Frank Balistrieri think about in those final months before heart failure claimed him in 1993? Did he regret the violence? Did he wish he had stayed out of Las Vegas, content with controlling Milwaukee's smaller, safer rackets? Did he wonder what his life might have been if he had used his intelligence and education for legitimate business instead of crime? Or was he, to the end, convinced that he had simply been caught, that the only mistake was getting caught, that the life he had lived was the only one worth living? We'll never know. Frank Balistrieri never wrote a memoir, never gave extensive interviews, never publicly reflected on his choices. he maintained omerta to the end, refusing to cooperate with authorities even when cooperation might have reduced his prison time. In that sense, at least, he lived by the code he had enforced on others: silence, loyalty to the organization, acceptance of consequences without complaint. But his silence leaves questions unanswered. What did it feel like to be feared by an entire city? What did it feel like to order a man's death and then continue with dinner, knowing that somewhere in Milwaukee a bomb was waiting to detonate, that someone's husband or father or son would turn a key and cease to exist? What did it feel like to sit in a Las Vegas casino, watching money flow across tables, knowing that a percentage of every dollar would be skimmed and sent to you, that you were stealing from corporations and state governments on a scale that dwarfed ordinary criminals? These questions remain forever unanswered. Frank Balistrieri took his secrets, his motivations, his inner life to his grave. All that remains are court records, FBI surveillance reports, newspaper articles, and the memories of people who knew him or feared him or both. From those fragments, we can reconstruct the history of what happened, but we can never fully understand why, never completely comprehend the mind of a man who could bomb cars and hug grandchildren, who could order murders and donate to churches, who could terrify mobsters from New York while maintaining the facade of a legitimate Milwaukee businessman. The Mad Bomber is dead, the organization he built is defunct, the city he controlled has forgotten most of what he did, and yet, in some way, Frank Balistrieri achieved a kind of immortality. His story is preserved in books, documentaries, true crime podcasts, and the oral histories of Milwaukee's Italian-American community. The movie Casino, though it focused primarily on Chicago and Kansas City mobsters, drew partly on events that involved Balistrieri and the Las Vegas Skim. His name is permanently etched in the history of American organized crime, remembered alongside more famous bosses like Al Capone, John Gotti, and Lucky Luciano. But is that really the immortality anyone would want? To be remembered for violence and crime, to have your name be synonymous with fear and murder, to know that your children and grandchildren will forever carry the burden of your choices, that every time someone searches your family name online, the first results will be about mafia trials and FBI investigations and car bombings. The Milwaukee Mafia's story ends not with a dramatic shootout or a spectacular trial, but with a quiet fading away. Old men dying in nursing homes, their made member status meaning nothing in the modern world. Restaurants and clubs closing, replaced by new businesses whose owners don't know or care about the criminal histories of the locations. Neighborhoods transforming, gentrifying, erasing the physical evidence of what happened there decades before. And finally, the last boss and the last consigliere dying within months of each other in 2024, leaving behind an organization that exists only in historical records and fading memories. In the end, perhaps that's the real lesson of the Milwaukee Mafia. Not that crime doesn't pay, though it clearly didn't for Frank Balistrieri, who died after spending a decade in prison. Not that violence has consequences, though it clearly did, as victims were murdered and families destroyed. The real lesson is about time and change, about how even the most powerful organizations eventually collapse when the world that sustained them disappears. The third ward that Vito Gardalabin ruled in 1915 no longer exists. The Milwaukee that Frank Balistrieri controlled in the 1970s has vanished. The American Mafia that once influenced politicians, labor unions, and major industries has been reduced to isolated criminal operations that make occasional headlines when someone gets indicted. 121 years after Vito Gardalabin stepped off a ship from Sicily, carrying the old ways to the New World, those ways have been completely erased from Milwaukee, replaced by a society that has no need for mob bosses, that doesn't tolerate ethnic criminal organizations, that has legal mechanisms to address the problems that immigrants once solved through illegal alternatives. That's progress, messy, complicated, imperfect progress, achieved through a combination of law enforcement pressure, social change, economic transformation, and demographic shifts that nobody could have predicted when Vito Gardalabin first established his Little Italy kingdom in Milwaukee's Third Ward. But progress nonetheless. The story of the Milwaukee Mafia is over. The organization is dead, its last boss and consigliere buried, its history preserved only in documents and memories. Milwaukee has moved on, building a future that has no room for the Mad Bomber and his empire of fear. And perhaps that's the only ending this story could have had: not sudden destruction, but slow erosion, not dramatic collapse, but quiet fading, until one day, nobody remembers who Frank Balistrieri was, or why the name once made people afraid. Except, of course, for stories like this one, reminding us of what was, what happened, and why it matters that it's gone.